Good morning, good afternoon, welcome. And if you're tuning in from Yerushalayim, a very happy third day of Purim Mishilash. This is the Covenant of Sinai with Rabbi David Silber, where we are joining Rabbi Silber as he continues his ongoing series covering the first two books of Tanakh, with this chunk focusing on the reception of Torah at Sinai and the episode of the Golden Calf, and its aftermath as formative events for the Jewish people. It's always a pleasure to be learning with Rabbi Silber, who is the founder and dean of Drisha. One note for this class, sources will be provided on screen from Sefaria, but if you have a preferred Tanakh or translation of the Bible, please keep it at hand as a reference. And with that, I want to hand things over to Rabbi Silber for today's class.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, just one more session on the reception of the Torah. One of the issues that is front and center is exactly what is taking place when. It's one of those sections in the Torah which, maybe more than any other, it's very unclear when things are occurring. And we have here several disputes amongst the medieval commentaries, and actually goes back way back to the Mechilta, the Medrash Halacha on the book of Shemot. Even there is a dispute about when some of these things actually take place. So we have the Ten Commandments, like I call them the Ten Commandments all the time because that's how they're known. They're not actually Ten Commandments, but Aseret HaDibrot, that's in chapter 20. And it runs through the 14th pasuk, the last of the Dibrot, Lo Tachmod Beit Reyecha. And then we have, after that, we have what we're going to pick up with today in the 15th pasuk. Before we get there, I just also want to mention, of course, that these 10 Dibrot are also found in the book of Devarim, chapter 5, in very similar, not identical, but very, very similar language with some differences. And there also, after these Dibrot, Moshe talks to the people about, there's a discussion there, what the people said. So we're going to see that's parallel to what we have over here in these Dibrot, followed by verse number 15, etc. And we'll get to that in a minute. But before we get there, I just wanted to make one other point. I mean, it's an obvious point, but I want to say it. However, the significance may not be obvious, which is the following. It's clear from the Chumash, whether we accept Rashi or the Ramban, that this reception of the Torah is a very significant event. We saw that from the very beginning, the way the Chumash sets it up. It's not just generally it says they were here and they traveled there. When it gets to Sinai, to receiving the Torah, it starts in the third month. In that day, they came to Sinai. So right away, you see that this is something different and special. What is interesting, though, are two things. First of all, that the Torah actually never tells us, gives us a date. It does say that they traveled to Sinai in the third month, but it doesn't give a specific date for the reception of the Torah. In fact, in the Talmud, there's a dispute. Did it take place on the 6th of the month or the 7th of the month? What's curious is there is actually no date. That's number one. I'll say three things. Number two, not only is there no date, but there's no sense in the Torah, I'm talking about the Torah, not the rabbinic tradition, nothing like that. What it says in the Chumash. There's absolutely no sense in the Chumash. Well, maybe the word absolutely is too strong. There's little sense in the Chumash that this event is marked as a holiday. Now, there's a holiday which represents leaving Egypt, that's Pesach. There's a holiday which represents perhaps traveling in the desert, which is Sukkot. When it comes to Shavuot, the third of the three regalim, the Torah never explicitly suggests at all that the holiday of Shavuot marks receiving the Torah. Quite the opposite. The Torah speaks about entering the land, the first fruits, Yom HaBikurim, but there's absolutely no mention in the Chumash that this event is marked by a holiday. And number three, what's also very interesting is that we have several places in the Tanakh, in which someone, maybe it's the psalmist, in Tehillim we have several historical psalms, which talk about the events that transpired from the time that we left Egypt till we enter the land. All kinds of things that took place. Typically, receiving the Torah is not mentioned. You wouldn't know from reading the Tehillim that there was such a thing as Matan Torah. Other things are mentioned. Crossing of the sea is mentioned. The story of Bilam trying to curse the Jews, that's mentioned. The battle against Sichon and Og, that's mentioned. But Matan Torah is not mentioned. And given these three facts, one has to wonder, what is that actually about? There's no doubt that in the rabbinic tradition, the holiday of Shavuot is Man Matan Toratenu. But the Chumash never suggests that at all, even though the time that it takes place is around the time we celebrate Shavuot. But the Torah never makes an explicit connection between receiving the Torah and the holiday of Shavuot. So this is a question I want to put out there. I mean, I think it's an obvious question. Anybody familiar with Tanakh knows this. I did hear once a very interesting thought. There's a fellow that teaches at JTS named Ben Summer, and he wrote, or I heard it in person from him, I don't remember. But he made the interesting, he advanced the interesting idea, and maybe there's something to it, that actually, since the Torah, in a sense, is so pervasive, since Matan Torah is something that colors everything else, the Tanakh doesn't want to limit it to a particular place or time. It's something that's pervasive. It pervades everything that we do. One might say it's sort of above time or beyond time. That was the claim that he made. I think it's an interesting claim. But whether we accept that or not, I think we should all be familiar with this fact that the Chumash never connects this event with a particular date. I think that's a question even for the Ramban. For Rashi, it's certainly a question. For Rashi, the whole purpose of leaving Egypt was to stand at Sinai. Rashi makes this point on multiple occasions. And even for the Ramban, who disagrees, who says the goal of leaving Egypt was not to receive the Torah, but rather to be a holy people. And the Torah is a necessary, but not sufficient. It's necessary, but not sufficient, the Ramban says, because you can observe the Torah meticulously, every detail, and be a bad person. That's what the Ramban claims, a rather remarkable statement, but that is what he says. The goal of leaving Egypt is what we have at the end of this book, is to dwell in God's presence, to have a mikdash, a holy place. A holy people needs a holy place. Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh. Even according to the Ramban would never dispute the fact that the receiving the Torah at Sinai is a monumental event. So it's a question, no matter how you interpret this book in terms of the ultimate goal. One might make the claim, I think possibly, as I'm talking, one could make the claim that, yes, we receive the Torah at Sinai, but depending how one understands receiving Torah, in other words, is everything given at one point, Matan Torah, we receive the Torah, or it's an important event, we receive much of the Torah then, but God continues to speak throughout the desert. God continues to command throughout the desert. It's not all given at one point. So that could be another possibility. The Torah in its entirety, of course, is most significant, but to limit it to one particular event, that we don't have. Of course, it begins perhaps with Sinai. Maybe it began before Sinai. We'll get to that, but it continues afterwards as well. In any event, I put out there the question, and the fact that it's not highlighted in many of the texts. For example, on Shabbat morning, in the Psukei de Zimra, in the prayers that we say, basically the Psalms that we say before, and the verses that we say before we read the blessings of the Shema, before we pray in Shema Shemona Esrei, is what's called the great Hallel, Hodu Hashem Kitov, Psalm 136. It talks about taking us out of Egypt, splitting the sea, defeating Paro, etc. Sichon and Og. There's no mention of the Torah at all. Doesn't mention the Torah. Reading that some you'd never know such a thing even happened. We say that every week. So it's simply a fact that I think should be thought about and addressed in some way. Okay, wanted to make that point before we continue our exploration of these verses. If anybody has any comment or question, I'll take it right now about what I just mentioned. Anybody wants to speak up, please do. Otherwise, we will begin in chapter 20 in the 15th pasuk. Okay, anybody? Nobody? Okay. Fine. So let's take a look at chapter 20, beginning with the 15th pasuk. It says, "V'chol ha'am ro'im et hakolot v'et harapidim v'et kol hashofar v'et har Hashem v'yara ha'am v'yonu v'yamdu me'rachok." This verse appears. All the people witnessed the thunder, the lightning, the shofar, the mountain smoking. When the people witnessed it, they fell back and stood at a distance. Vayimru Moshe, they said to Moshe, "Daber ato imanu v'nishma." You speak to us, and we will hear. V'yahu yadaber imanu Elohim pen namut. We don't want God to speak to us, lest we die. Vayomam Moshe la'am al tiro. And Moshe said to the people, "Don't be afraid. God is doing this in order to nasot etchem." I mentioned once the question about what nasot means. I'll come back to that. But it's essentially for your benefit. In order to inculcate in you fear of God, to prevent sin. The people stood back. And Moses entered the thick cloud where God was. So, presumably, if we read the Torah in a direct, just things are in order. This all takes place after the 10 Commandments. People have heard the Aseret HaDibrot. They've heard God's voice, right? And they're afraid. Now, even though they've heard God's voice and they've survived hearing God's voice, but what they're saying is, we heard God's voice till now, we have survived it, but it was extremely frightening, and we're worried. If it continues in this way, perhaps we won't be able to survive. I think that's the plain reading of the Chumash. And if you look at these verses, and now we jump for one moment to the parallel, which is in Sefer Devarim, chapter 5. Sefer Devarim, chapter 5 has these same 10 dibrot, and they conclude in chapter 5, the last dibra is verse number 18, Lo Tachmod. And we have right afterwards parallel presentation in the Torah. It says there, "Et hadvarim ha'ele diber Hashem el kol ka'alchem bahar mitoch ha'esh ha'anan v'harafel kol gadol v'lo yasaf v'yichdevei ma'shnei luchot avanim v'yitneim Elai." Remember, Sefer Devarim, Moshe is the speaker. So Moshe says these things, these words, these Devarim, God spoke to the entire congregation from the fire and the cloud and the thick cloud, a sound, a call, a mighty sound, right? Which mighty sound below Yasaf, which kept on talking, kept on speaking. And then God wrote down, right? God wrote these things down and gave them to me, says Moshe. And when you heard this, the sound, the coal, out of the darkness and the fire, your leaders approached me, your elders. You said, God has revealed God's power to us. We heard God's voice out of the fire. Now we realize it's possible for the human to hear God's voice and still live. But now, why should we die? In other words, we know it's possible you can survive this encounter, but we survived it till now. But there's no guarantee we will continue to survive it if God continues to speak. If we continue Lishmoa et Kol Hashem Eloheinu Od V'Amadu. But we're worried if we continue to hear God's voice, we'll die. There's no precedent for this, hearing the voice of God from the fire and surviving. Therefore, you should draw near. You hear what God has to say. Et Kol Asher Yomar Hashem Eloheinu. When you speak to us, so we have exact parallel. In each case, right after the 10 Dibrot, the people go to Moshe and they say to Moshe, we're concerned if God continues to speak, we'll be in danger. We ask you to hear what God has to say and to convey to us the information. Now, that's the plain reading. The Ramban has a different way to understand this, but let's leave the Ramban out for now. But the plain reading of the Chumash is these are two parallel stories, and God's response is parallel as well. The response in the book over here in Devarim, it's open to Devarim already, says, Vayishma Hashem et kol divreichem v'daberchem elai, and God heard what you were saying. Vayomer Hashem elai, shamati et kol divrei ha'am hazeh asher divu elecha, heitivu kol asher dibelu. God said, I hear what the people are saying. It's very good. Very, very good. Tell them, go back to your tents. Go back to your tents. You stay with me, Moshe. And I will teach you, I'll teach you all of the commandments. And you teach them. So that's what God says. Very good. Let them go back to their daily life, to their tents. You stay with me. I'm going to teach you. I'm going to teach you the commandments they should fulfill when they enter the land. Right? And it goes on, etc. And the chapter 6, a couple of verses later, says, V'zot ha-mitzvah hachukim ve'amishpatim asher tziva Hashem Elokechem u'hamed etchem lasot ba'aretz. And now I'm going to tell you, says Moshe, the commandments that God taught me to perform in the land. That's what it says in Devarim chapter 5, beginning of chapter 6. Over here, back to our chapter, the people go to Moshe and they say to Moshe, we don't want to hear God's voice anymore. Moshe says, don't be afraid, it's all for a purpose. But Moshe then goes into the cloud to hear what God has to say. That's the plain, and God begins to speak to Moshe beginning in the 19th pasuk. That's the plain reading. Now, what's actually very interesting, by the way, which is indirectly related to what we're studying, but it's very interesting, is that when you read the verses in Sefer Devarim, what's interesting is what it sounds like. This is actually a very important point. What it sounds like is Moshe goes up back up to the mountain. Moshe is going to receive commandments, and Moshe is going to convey the commandments to the people. Now, what does Moshe convey to the people? Which commandments are we talking about? So in our book, in Sefer Shemot, beginning in verse number 19, God speaks to Moshe. And these are the commandments that Moshe is going to relay to the people. Now, it begins in chapter 20, in the 19th pasuk, and it runs all the way through chapter 23. That's what God tells Moshe. Only Moshe. No one else is hearing it. And most of these are commandments. All of chapter 21, the end of 20, all of chapter 21, all of chapter 22, and even chapter 23, up to verse number 20, are all commandments. The end of chapter 23 is about entering the land. God will send an angel to help us conquer the land. But for all of 21, 22, end of 20, and half of 23, that's what Moshe received from God. Moshe will go down and relay the information to the people. That's what it says in our book. But what it seems to say in Sefer Devarim is extremely interesting. Because what Moshe says in Sefer Devarim, if you looked at it very carefully, you saw that God says to Moshe, tell them to go back to their tents, and I'm going to tell you all of the mitzvot they are to perform in the land, ba'aretz. And chapter 6 begins, now these are the mitzvot that you perform in the land. So according to Sefer Devarim, what it sounds like is this. When Moshe's on the Sefer Devarim is taking place, 38, 39 years later. What it sounds like in Sefer Devarim, what did Moshe receive at Mount Sinai? What Sefer Devarim, the claim of Sefer Devarim, is that Moshe, when Moshe was at Sinai, when Moshe by himself went up to Har Sinai, he received all of the commandments, not just the ones over here, not just the ones in chapter 20, 21, 22, 23, which we have in our book, but all of the commandments that Moshe relays to the people in Sefer Devarim, which are bulk of the commandments. There are more mitzvot in Sefer Devarim by far than any other book. And the point is, what the book seems to be saying is that those commandments, Moshe was told at Sinai, he was told 40 years earlier. But he never told the people those commandments. He kept it to himself. In fact, the people that left Egypt never heard those commandments because they all died in the desert. Sefer Devarim is about relaying those commandments in the last year of Moshe's life to the people who will possess the land and fulfill the commandments inside the land. That's the claim of Sefer Devarim. That's a very interesting claim. In other words, in Sefer Devarim, what it sounds like is that Moshe is given the whole Torah at Sinai. Even all of those commandments that Moshe relays in the 40th year of the desert, in the last couple of months of his life, they were given at Sinai. But for whatever reason, Moshe never relayed those commandments. Why didn't he relay them? I can't answer that question. Maybe he sensed that we're not going to get into the land. The sense you get in the Chumash is that Moshe thought we're going to be in the land much earlier, like 38 years earlier. It never happened. So Moshe never relays those commandments. And the commandments of Sefer Devarim were given at Sinai. And I will say one other point about Matan Torah. It is certainly true what I said before, that when you read the Bible, you don't get a sense in the Bible that this Sinai was that special. You just don't. It's just not there, okay? But there is one place where you do get that sense, one book of the Bible, which is Sefer Devarim. In Sefer Devarim, Sinai, Matan Torah, is actually central. Sefer Devarim is the book that has, in terms of our own practice, our liturgy, our practice, I would say if there's any one place where it's coming out of, it's Sefer Devarim. The core pieces of our liturgy are coming out of Sefer Devarim. The recitation of the Shema, the first two paragraphs of the Shema are Sefer Devarim. The Seder, the main text of the Seder, Arami Oved Avi, Sefer Devarim, and other texts as well. So in terms of our liturgy, Sefer Devarim is essential. And Sefer Devarim does present Sinai as a central event, and it does, in a sense, have it marked on our calendar. And I want to say two things about Matan Torah and Sefer Devarim. One, I mentioned last week or 2 weeks ago, that the Torah says, do not forget what happened at Sinai. Don't forget the experience at Sinai and teach your children. The Ramban counted as one of the 613 commandments to remember the events, the revelation of Sinai. But secondly, in terms of what I mentioned earlier, that in the Torah, there's no marker. Matan Torah is not marked as a festival in the Chumash. I have to qualify what I said before. There is, in a sense, one marker on the calendar in the Torah in which we recall Sinai. And that is, the Torah says that towards the very end of the Chumash, in Parashat Vayelech, there's a mitzvah every 7th year on the holiday of Sukkot to gather all the people together and for someone to read us the Torah. And it sounds like it's a kind of re-experiencing of Sinai. It's the mitzvah called Hakel. And the Sefer Devarim refers to Matan Torah as Yom HaKahal, the day of the gathering. So I have to qualify what I said before, that there's nothing on our calendar which actually marks Matan Torah. I have to qualify that. Sefer Devarim, there is, now only once every 7 years, but once every 7 years we are re-experiencing Sinai through the mitzvah of Hakel, which takes place on Chag HaSukkot. We, the Jewish people, in a certain sense, have actually, we are recalling Hakel every year, because the last day of Sukkot, which is Shmini Atzeret, essentially, but outside Israel, there are 2 days of Shmini Atzeret, because we keep always in the second day, because of the Sveika Diyoma. But long ago, the last day of Shmini Atzeret was called Simchat Torah. Simchat Torah. So Simchat Torah is a rejoicing of the Torah, and we have the very strange custom to complete reading the Torah on Simchat Torah. This is the only time when we read the Torah, the regular Torah reading, not on Shabbat. We complete the Torah on Simchat Torah. We begin the Torah on Simchat Torah. So the idea of the holiday really, which marks receiving the Torah, is actually the holiday of Sukkot, the end of Sukkot, and that takes us back to the Chumash. And in point of fact, I would just add one more detail here, which is that in the land of Israel, unlike Chutz La'aretz, unlike Babel, we have a practice of reading the Torah, finishing the Torah every single year. But in ancient Israel, they finished the Torah twice in 7 years. They would complete the Torah twice in 7 years, which takes us back to the mitzvah of Hakel, which is once every 7 years, and they would complete it on the holiday of Sukkot. So the point is that there is a marker of sorts in the Chumash, in Sefer Devarim, and that in thinking about the event of Sinai as a central event, the place where it really emerges as a very, very central event is actually Sefer Devarim, which is, as I said before, in terms of our own practice, Sefer Devarim is extremely important. For the core rituals, we had to pick out 2 core rituals. I would say Shema and Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim are 2 of the core, if not the most basic mitzvot that we have, ritual mitzvot that we have, both emerging from Sefer Devarim. Okay, wanted to point that out. I think it's an important qualification to what I said before. Okay, now we are going to, before I jump to the next point, if anybody wants to comment or question at this point, it's a good time.
I have a question. Why is it that Yehoshua doesn't mention it? That's always bothered me when he goes through at the end.
The end of Sefer Yoshua?
Yeah.
No, I know that. The point is, it's a good question, but it's not a better question, and then it's not mentioned in general. Again, it's not mentioned in general. Again, in terms of the rabbinic tradition, for Rashi, it's the central thing. For Rashi, the whole purpose was to receive the Torah.
Right.
I mean, what I'm saying is that when you read the Tanakh, that doesn't emerge. In other words, what comes through is either because it's a process over time. In other words, let me put it to you this way, okay? This raises all kinds of interesting questions, which I'm not going to deal with now. It's also not my expertise, but let me make a simple point. The rabbinic tradition built up Matan Torah as probably the central event, absolutely the central event. And by the way, and part of that is, and for whatever reason, they made it very clear that event of standing in Sinai is the event. So, for example, the Gemara says, it comes up right in the beginning of Tractate Megillah, other places as well, Ein Navi Rashoi L'Chadesh Davar. There's no new mitzvot. The prophets can tell you you're doing right, you're doing wrong, you're fulfilling the mitzvot, you're not fulfilling the mitzvot, but the prophets can't institute any new mitzvot. All the mitzvot are only from Moshe. prophecy of Moshe, no one else can ever add any mitzvot. There are rabbinic decrees. That's a different story. To protect, to guard, etc. That's rabbinic. But in terms of the mitzvot, it's only from the Torah. That's what the Gemara says. Now, when I say that's what the Gemara says, in other words, when you read the Bible, is that necessarily the case? It's certainly the case that the prophets are there to chastise us and to rebuke us and to guide us. But is that really true? That's what the Gemara says. But my point is that if one took a different point of view, in other words, if you say the only mitzvot you have are the ones given by Moshe, then obviously the Sinai becomes an absolutely central event because this is it. It's a one-time event. If one took a different position, that mitzvot can be given throughout history. Maybe there'll be times when there are no additional mitzvot. Maybe there'll be more mitzvot. It's certainly a reasonable position, but it's not the rabbinic position for the most part. But doing that, it's a way of saying this is the event. But when you read the Bible, I'll say for myself, you don't get that sense at all, actually.
Right.
You don't get that sense. So that's the fact. It's a case where the rabbis are reading it a certain way for whatever reason. One can suggest many reasons, but it's not at all clear that that's the case. But it's certainly true that that is the rabbinic position.
And they make it one of the Sheish Zechiros.
Sheish Zechiros, it's one of the Rambam's 13 principles of faith.
Right.
The prophecy of Moshe is, we can talk about it a lot and try to even explain why that might be significant. In other words, part of it is certainly, there's no question about this, whatever the initial intention was, that the prophecy of the Torah is the prophecy of Moshe. He's also a prophet. He's a prophet of a different order. And therefore, no other prophet can contradict what Moses' prophecy is because it's a higher level prophecy. Maimonides had 10, 11 levels of prophecy. I forget how many. Moshe's prophecy is unique. And the Torah seems to say this as well. Moshe's different.
Right.
That means if someone comes later and says, Moshe's prophecy is very good, we have a new prophecy which is greater than Moses. The Rambam says that's not possible. No prophecy can be greater than Moses. And other people have come and said, yeah, Moshe's prophecy is fine. We have a new
one.
A new one. So the Rambam, the tradition was to safeguard against that by saying that can't be. There are other prophets, but they can't overturn Moses' prophecy, which is law. And Moses' prophecy is different. Moses' prophecy is actually law, and other prophecies are not law. That's the claim the rabbis of the Talmud make. That's the rabbinic tradition. But the question is, does that square with what the Bible says? That's a very good question. That's my point. I'm simply raising a question. That's all. I'm pointing out what I think is an obvious fact, that outside of Sefer Dvarim, when you have the histories, yeah, Yeshua is an excellent example. He's Moses' devoted servant, and Moses received the Torah, handed it down to Joshua, right? You respect Joshua, the recipient of the Torah, Moses' faithful servant, who departs not from the tent, to mention Matan Torah.
Right.
It's missing. It's missing everywhere, actually. So the point is, it is something to think about. Let's leave it at that. Anybody else with comments or questions? I mean, let me just say one thing about.
I have a question from chat from Susan Lieberman.
Go ahead.
Is it possible that the Torah plays down the day of Matan Torah because of Chet HaEgel? It lost significance, wasn't successful.
Well, that is a very, very interesting question. I have actually a lot to say about that, but I have to table that for now. It is true that the event of Sinai would seem to be undermined by the golden calf. The Torah that we do receive, the second tablets, as it were, Moses goes up silently one morning. There's no fireworks, there's no thunder, there's no lightning, there's no shofar, and he receives the Torah a second time, a new Torah, as it were. Yeah, I mean, that would explain why Sinai per se might be downplayed, possibly. But on the other hand, he's simply getting a replacement for the first tablet, so it wouldn't undermine necessarily the idea of receiving God's word at that particular point in time, whether it takes place at Sinai or 40 days later or whatever. But there's more to say about that, and maybe in the future we can talk about that as well, because it is true. I mean, the question actually raises a very interesting problem, which is, on one hand, we talk about Matan Torah and Sinai and standing Sinai and the fire and all that, the great revelation, not to forget it. 1 second. But the golden calf seems to undermine the entire thing. Moses comes down the mountain, he smashes the tablets. You got to start all over again. So what happened? So the event, so presumably the revelation of Sinai should lose its great significance. If anything, we should mark the receiving of the second tablets, which were given silently to Moshe or privately to Moshe. That's an excellent question. There's more to say about that. I'll have to leave that for now, but the question is a good one. Anybody else? Okay, so now let's begin. That's part one. Let's get to part two over here. Okay, so now we come to, we're going to skip for now the end of chapter 20 and 21, 22, 23. We're going to get back to it. That's a whole, we'll see how much time we spend. Those are all the laws, the Mishpatim.
Rabbi?
Maybe we'll spend an entire semester on just the laws of Mishpatim. Spend a year on it too, but I wanted to move it to skip that for now.
Rabbi, one
Yes,
last thing.
another question?
Just want to add about what you just said, that we do make the giving of the second luchot very, very important, because that's Yom Kippur. So we do play up the second giving of the second.
Right, no, for sure. The second luchot are given on Yom Kippur, but you know that, I know that. A lot of people don't even know that. Right? So the Yom Kippur is the day of Matan Torah. That is true. And it's probably not an accident, not a coincidence that the day of receiving the second tablets is the great day of atonement. I mean, those two things are presumably related to each other. But we'll talk more about that when we get to the golden calf episode. But before we get to the golden calf, we have to take a look at chapter 24. Now, chapter 24, once again, of course, we have a dispute of Rashi and the Ramban. We're going to basically go with the Ramban, but let's start with chapter 24, and let's see what it says. So this is all these, Moshe has been given all of these laws privately. Remember, because the people said they were afraid to hear God's voice. Moshe goes up himself, and he receives all of these laws, the end of chapter 20, and then beginning of chapter 21, and now we get to chapter, so now Moshe's been told everything, and now we get to chapter 24. Okay, V'yo Moshe Omar, Alei El Hashem, Atah v'Aaron Nadav v'Avihu, v'shivim miziknei Yisrael, v'ishtachavitem merachok. V'nigash Moshe levado El Hashem, v'hem lo yigashu, v'ya'am lo ya'alu imo. So this is a big question over here. The translation that we have in front of us, what I'm seeing on the page, says, then God said to Moses, come up to Hashem with Aaron, David, Avihu, and 70 elders and bow low from afar. And Moshe should go by himself to God. The others should not go up with him. So when is this statement made? When is this happening? So let's work with this translation that Moshe is told now. Moshe was given all of these laws, chapter 21, 22, 23, and now Moshe is told, even though Moshe Omar translates better as Moshe had been told, right? It didn't say Vayomer Hashem El Moshe. It says Moshe Omar. Moshe had been told, go up to God. But let's assume that the people, Moshe and Aaron and Nadav and Avihu and the elders, are to come up now or today, tomorrow, to come closer to God, to bow from a distance, but Moshe himself will go up to God. So let's assume this is taking place now, after Moshe has been given all these mishpatim. Right. But then what's interesting is that doesn't happen. In other words, verse 1 and verse 2, it happens in verse number 9, right? In verse number 9, there it says, Vayal Moshe v'Aaron Nadav v'Avihu v'shivim miziknei Yisrael. In verse number 9, it says that Moshe, Aaron, Nadav, and Avihu, and the elders actually went up with Moshe, and etc. And it describes what happens. We'll get to those extremely puzzling verses in verse 10 and verse 11. We'll get there. But that's what it sounds like. It sounds like there's a command in verse 1 and 2 of chapter 24. And the fulfillment is in verse number 9 and verse number 10 and verse number 11. That's what it sounds like. And in the interim, we have, beginning at verse number 3, something else takes place, which is of extreme significance. And I wanted to take a look at this. Here, of course, there's a dispute between Rashi and the Ramban once again, but we're going to read these verses in order, like the Ramban does. Ramban typically, not always, but typically, thinks the Torah is in chronological order. So let's take a look now at chapter 24, these very, very significant psukim. Vayavo Moshe, vayisaper la'am et kol divrei Hashem v'et kol hamishpatim. So Moshe came to the people. He told the people the words of God and the mishpatim. So the Ramban says the words of God refers to the end of chapter 20. The mishpatim refer to what chapter 21, verse number 1, V'yela hamishpatim asher tosim lifneihem. It seems like a very straightforward and plain reading. Rashi had a different understanding. Rashi understood this is taking place before Matan Torah. But the Ramban, before the revelation, is before God appeared at Sinai. The Ramban says, no, not at all. Because Moshe is now telling them what God told Moshe. The people didn't hear this because they said to Moshe, we're afraid. So Moshe went up by himself and he's getting all of these laws. How long is he on the mountain? The Ramban thinks he's there for one day. Just a day. He got all of these laws. He comes down the next day and he tells the people what God had told them. He's reading to them all of these laws. The end of chapter 20, 21, 22, 23. He tells the people. And when the people hear this, Vayan kol ha'am kol echad vayomru kol hadvarim asher diber Hashem na'aseh. The people said in one voice, all that God has spoken, we will do. It's similar to what they said in chapter 19, right? When Moshe went to them in chapter 19. And God said, go tell other people, I want to make a covenant with them. I want to give them the Torah. And Moshe goes down the mountain. And Moshe says, the people say, na'aseh. And here we have the same thing over here. Also na'aseh. Na'aseh is related to everything that they have just been heard. They just heard this now for the first time. Moshe is telling them all that God has spoken. The Dvarim and the Mishpatim, but after Moshe tells them all the things that God has spoken. In other words, the Mishpatim are also the word of God. Even though we didn't hear it directly from God, but you are God's agent. Everything you have told us comes from God. You're not making it up. Kol Dvarim are coming from God. And we will do it. Na'aseh. Now we have interesting. Vayichtov Moshe et kol divrei Hashem. Now Moshe wrote these things down. First he tells them orally what God has said, and they say, yes, we are committing to doing that. Then he writes it down. Vayichtov Moshe et kol divrei Hashem. Unlike the tablets that God writes, this Moshe writes. Vayashkem baboker, gets up early in the morning. Vayiven mizbeach tachat tahar, and he builds an altar. Ushtei mesrei matzeva, he sets up 12 pillars. Ushnei masar shivtei Yisrael, which are represent the 12 tribes of Israel. Vayishlach et narei b'nei Yisrael vayalu olot. Vayizbechu zvachim shlamim l'Hashem parim. He sent the young designated, here they say designated, Na'arei b'nei Yisrael, young men of Israel. Na'arei b'nei Yisrael. Perhaps the Ramban suggests that Na'arei b'nei Yisrael is in contrast to the Zikanim. They're the older ones who are going to go up the mountain, but the younger ones, they're called Na'arim. The younger ones, he sends them to bring sacrifices. And they bring two kinds of sacrifices. They bring burnt offering, that's an olah, burnt offering. And they also bring zvachim shlamim, Hashem parim, and they also bring shlamim. Those are sacrifices that the one who brings the sacrifice eats part of the sacrifice. The priest gets a part of the sacrifice, and part is burnt on the altar. So it's shlamim. Everyone, the priest, the people, and God, each get their portions. So these are the ola ushlamim. And we remember, by the way, we certainly remember that when Moshe spoke to Paro way back when, and Moshe said, we want to, our God has called upon us to serve God, right? And we got to serve God by bringing sacrifices. And Moshe mentioned specifically Olot and Shlamim. Olot and Shlamim. So here we have Olot and Shlamim. Here we have the two kinds of sacrifices being brought to God in this context of something is taking place. Moshe is building an altar. The people have accepted these additional commandments, right? Additional commandments. And now we have the next few verses of extreme importance.
And he also
Moshe,
said, Bin Arenu Uviziknenu.
yeah, that's a good point. That is very true. Very good point. Moshe had emphasized, very good, excellent point. And Moshe spoke to Paro, when Paro said, whom do you want to send? And Moshe said, everybody. Bin Arenu Uviziknenu Nelech. The young and the old, and here you have exactly the Zakanim earlier, and now we have the Na'arim as well. Very good point. Thank you for that. Vayikach Moshe Chatzi Adam. Now Moshe took half of the blood of the slaughtered animals. Vayosem Ba'aganot, he placed that in basins. The Chatzi Adam Zarak al HaMizbeach, half the blood he throws on the altar. Vayikach Sefer Habrit, he took the book of the covenant. The first time the Torah didn't call it the book of the covenant. He wrote it down, it says. But now it calls that a sefer. It's a book and a book of the covenant. Vayikra biyozneham, he reads it to the people. They had already heard it once. He reads it again. Vayomer, vayomru, and the people when they heard it again, Kol Hashem diber Hashem na'aseh v'nishma. Here we have na'aseh v'nishma. I'll come back to nishma in a minute. Vayikach Moshe et Adam. He took the remaining blood, the other half of the blood, right? By Yomer, he said, he throws the blood on the people. This is the blood of the covenant, which God has made concerning these things. So here we have a remarkable description. We have, first of all, the laws that he's writing down. Let's say, according to the Ramban, Elah Mishpatim, this book is called the Book of the Covenant. The Book of the Covenant. The tablets are called Luchot Abrit, the tablets of the covenant that God writes. But these rules, Elah Mishpatim, are the Book of the Covenant. And they enter into the covenant with sacrifice. Half the blood is thrown on the altar. Half the blood is thrown on the people. And the blood is the blood of the covenant. Now, according to, let's go with the Ramban's position, which I think is the plain reading of the Chumash. You have then, there are two different elements, two different things taking place over here. There's what took place at Sinai with the fire and the thunder and all that, and the shofar, and receiving the Torah. That's one thing, and preceded by the preparations for receiving the Torah. The chibsusim rotam, hagbalah, keeping your distance, etc. All the preparations. That's one thing that's taking place. And then there's the additional, this commitment of through the blood. Hinei dam habrit asher karat Hashem al kol hadvarim ha'eleh. I had mentioned earlier that when the Gemara speaks about becoming a Jew, choosing to be Jewish, the Gemara talks about the Jewish people becoming Jewish, entering into the covenant, with circumcision for the men, with ritual immersion for all, and with sacrifice for all. Now, we don't have a sacrifice nowadays, but the Gemara says the sacrifice is not does not prevent one from becoming Jewish. It's an additional obligation. If someday there's a temple, you bring the sacrifice, but you can become Jewish without the sacrifice. That's the standard view. There's one odd view that you can't actually, but that has not been accepted. So the point is, but there seem to be two different stages over here. There's one kind of commitment. There's a commitment that the Torah spoke of in chapter 19, chapter 20 of Naaseh, and the commitment of Naaseh v'nishma over here, which takes place afterwards. That's the commitment through the blood of the sacrifice. sounds like it's a different kind of commitment. In other words, the commitment over here through the blood of the sacrifice, the idea of the sacrifice is basically myself. In other words, sacrifice is instead of me, in lieu of me. The idea that one commits fully to God, then the commitment can be very extreme. Under certain conditions, one is even required to forfeit one's life. For certain very severe, crimes. That's related to the Dama Brit. That's the blood of the sacrifice. That's a different level. So this is the covenant. And this covenant, actually, the people, when Moshe reads them first, the laws, they say Naaseh. When Moshe writes it down and reads it to them, they say Naaseh v'nishma. So what does Naaseh v'nishma mean? What does nishma mean? We will do v'nishma. We will do and we will, what's it mean? We will do and we will listen. Normally you listen before you do. What does it mean Naaseh v'nishma? Well, what is the plain meaning of Naaseh v'nishma? I think the plain meaning is what some of the commentaries suggest, which is Naaseh, everything we heard we're going to do. You read to us all these laws of chapter 21, the Mishpatim, we're going to do them. But also Nishma. Nishma means more than what we heard today. We are committing ourselves to be God's servants. We're committing ourselves to enter into the covenant. So yes, this is what we heard now. But maybe in the future we'll have other things we're going to hear from God, other obligations, other concerns. So Nishma means that also. It's a full commitment. It's not just a commitment about what we're hearing today, but it's Naaseh v'nishma. So this is the last stage. In other words, we talk about Matan Torah. We know all kind of Naaseh v'nishma, but many people don't realize that Naaseh v'nishma is not in chapter 19 or 20. It's in chapter 24. It's afterwards. And what I just want to make one point before we get to the next topic, which is, and when you think about the book of the covenant, right? We talk about the 10 commandments: don't kill, tignov, tinaf, tirtzach, idolatry. The book of the covenant, and we'll hopefully study this together, maybe in the future. What is in the book of the covenant? Things like, if you dig a pit in the thoroughfare and an animal falls in, you got to pay. If my ox gores your ox, I have to pay, depending how did it happen before or not. Someone gives me something to wash and I was negligent, I have to pay. Among many other things, all kinds of rules about slavery, all kinds of rules about the festivals. In other words, some of them seem quite mundane. In other words, rules of damages, or I damage, my property damages, etc. Those kind of rules, that's part of what the Torah calls the book of the covenant. The covenant is not about some abstractions. The covenant is about daily living and how you live with the other person, basically, and responsibilities you have towards other individuals, towards the community, etc. And the book of the covenant contains those laws, in addition to laws of festivals, ritual law, etc., idolatry. It's all coming from the same place. It's all God's command. But I think it's just to think about that for a moment. The book of the covenant. This is the blood of the covenant. This is the fullest commitment. It's all about living a daily life in a way that is taking responsibility for what we do. That the Torah calls the book of the covenant. And the people say, we accept all this, and what we'll hear in the future, we also accept. This is the basis of our commitment. But it's not limited to just what's written now. It can be many other laws. The Torah has many other laws. Naaseh v'nishma means we accept even what we don't hear now. We accept on faith for the future. Okay, so this is actually this is the Ramban. And now for the Ramban, remember that in the first two verses, Moshe was told to come up to the mountain together with Aaron, Nadav, Avihu, and the 70 elders. And you're going to into the cloud, you go yourself, not the others. The others have to stay back to some extent. And now we have, in these last two verses, we'll take a look at this now, for our purposes, we have three verses. Verse number 9, 10, and 11, we have a fulfillment of what God commanded Moshe back in the first two verses of chapter 24. But before this can happen, in other words, why did the Torah set it up this way? Why didn't the Torah say God said to Moshe, go up the mountain? And then the next verse would say, and Moshe went up the mountain. Verse number 9. Vayal Moshe v'Aaron nadav avihu v'shivim miziknei Yisrael. But apparently, the fact that intervening between verse 2 and verse 9, we have this blood of the covenant, we have the Nasa v'Nishma, is very significant, because then the going up the mountain and experiencing God's presence, that we'll come to in a moment, takes on a different meaning once you see it in the context of what precedes it. In other words, what it sounds like actually is that this experience of God, standing in God's presence, is also a way to finalize the covenant. The covenant is finalized not just through what we say, not only through the sacrifice, but by the very being in God's presence, and as we'll see in a minute, maybe even something additional. So let me just read these last three verses, say a couple of things about them. They're very unusual psukim, and then we'll take comments and questions and complete the session. So Vayal, first number 9, says Vayal Moshe v'Aaron nadav avihu v'shivim miziknei Yisrael. So this is what it said in the first pasuk. So now with Moshe and the elders and Aaron and Nadav Avihu are doing what God said they should do, to go up to God, to bow down from a distance. And now we have the next verse, which of course is one of these verses that's a puzzler, to put it, put it lightly. It's a puzzler. Vayu'ud eit Elohei Yisrael. It's literally, they saw the God of Israel. V'tachat raglav k'maaseh livnat hasapir uchi etzem hashamayim latoah. It is one of the more remarkable verses of the Bible. Literally, they saw the God of Israel. They saw God. But then it says, wait a minute, they saw God. Under God's feet, tachat raglav, the likeness of a pavement of sapphire, like the very sky for purity. Etzem hashamayim latoah. From that, it sounds like they didn't actually see God, but they saw tachat raglav, literally under God's feet. One, of course, you can imagine that the Rambam did not take this verse literally. I mean, to put it mildly. The point is, but why in fact does the Torah, I would ask the Rambam this question, if it's not to be taken literally, and we have nothing like this anyplace else. What is the point? Why did the Torah make the suggestion, under God's feet, the likeness of a pavement of sapphire, like the sky from Etzem Hashamayim Latoah? It's very hard to know why, but first of all, before we get to why it's presented in such striking terms, the idea of the revelation, the idea of standing in God's presence, which follows the covenant, is a way of emphasizing the bond that has been established between God on one hand and the people on the other. And just to follow this point through, you have the next verse. It says, V'yel atzilei b'nei Yisrael lo sholach yado. God did not raise God's hand against the atzilim, the leaders. I'll get to that word atzilim. Let's say leaders. Against these leaders, God did not lo sholach yado. L'shloach yad doesn't mean to raise your hand. It means to harm. We had this, for example, in one place where it comes up, among many places. One place where it comes up as a prominent expression is in Megillat Esther, right? Asher bikshu l'shloach yad b'melech Achashverosh. Bigtan and Teresh wanted to l'shloach yad against Achashverosh. They wanted to kill him, probably, to assassinate him. Achashverosh says to Esther, Haman was killed because he tried to l'shloach yad by Yehudim, to harm the Jews, to kill them. So l'shloach yad, right, means to harm or to kill. Says the Torah, these people who witnessed God, but God did not harm them. Lo sholach yado, right? Playing on, they saw tachat raglav, but nonetheless, lo sholach yado. the suggestion is then maybe God, you might have thought God would have annihilated them. You stand in God's presence and you're not prepared for that, you can be destroyed. You will be destroyed. Standing in God's presence is very dangerous. But here they had permission. Here they were commanded to come up. So despite the fact that something very inappropriate is happening, something unusual is happening. I mean, Jacob said when he wrestled with the angel, I have seen God face to face and I have survived. He was astonished that he could survive the encounter. But over here, the Torah goes out of its way to say they were not harmed. You would have thought they couldn't persevere under those circumstances. No. Lo shalach yado. Vayechazu et Elohim. They witnessed God. They saw God. Vayechazu. They beheld God. Vayochlu vayishtu. They ate and they drank. So let me just say one or two words about this, and I would open it up for questions, and we'll stop at this point afterwards. So first of all, here's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking what the Torah is trying to tell us. On one hand, there's a covenant between the people and God. The blood of the covenant, Dam HaBrit. The book is called Sefer HaBrit. The tablets are Luchot HaBrit. A covenant is an agreement. And it's often an agreement between parties who are basically on the same level, or not on the same level. But to some extent, there's some kind of commonality. Yet over here, it's not just the question of God and the people never being on the same level. That's clear. But what people are we talking about? We're talking about a bunch of people who left Egypt 3 months earlier. Unclear what they were like when they were in Egypt. Maybe we'll talk about that in the future when we get to the golden calf. But they left 3 months earlier, and what they've done essentially since they left is complain about God. They complained before they crossed the sea. They complained after they crossed the sea. They complained about food in chapter 16. They complained about water in chapter 17. And you ask the question, these people enter into a covenant with God? I mean, a bunch of slaves, a bunch of complaining slaves. The first words out of their mouth is, we shouldn't have left Egypt. There's something very odd about, one might say even inappropriate about this. Nonetheless, God has invited them into the covenant. Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh, Shmartem et Briti. And in this context, actually, maybe that's why the Chumash actually emphasizes more than any other place that I can think of, actually seeing God. It's in very graphic terms. They beheld God, what they saw under God's feet. In other words, they're seeing something the Torah has presented. How could they actually experience God? They can only experience God if they can actually see something they can actually really see, as opposed to seeing the idea of God or an abstraction. But for these people, and not only that, we have the last pasuk of ours, Vayechazu et Elohim vayochlu vayishtu. And here we have a very interesting question, and I'm wondering what you think about this. Vayochlu vayishtu, is that a positive or is that a negative? They beheld God and they ate and they drank. I did want to say one thing. I think the commentaries are very divided about this. But what strikes me, and I'll just put in my 2 cents, is that the people beheld God. Now remember, the Chumash distinguishes here between Moshe and the rest of the people. You're all going to come up the mountain, but only you, Moshe, will go into the cloud. They will not go, but they also can witness me. And the witnessing me is part of the covenant. It's like when you sit and eat with somebody. Jacob sits with Lavan. He's making a deal. He's making an agreement. He's making a treaty. Yitro comes, we had this earlier, he comes to Moshe and he brings sacrifices, right? And he eats with Aaron and the elders, right? He eats with them. Eating with them is a way of saying we are part of we are connected to each other. Eating together is not just a biological act, it's a social act. And over here, the people are connecting to God through Vayochu Vayishtu. But what's interesting is that the people eating in God's presence, Vayochu Vayishtu, even as they witness God, stands in very striking contrast to what we're told later about Moshe. When Moshe ascends the mountain, the Torah says for 40 days and 40 nights, Lechem lo achavu mayim lo shata. Moshe neither eats nor drinks. Moshe is consumed with God's presence. He doesn't eat or drink. So over here, Vayochu Vayishtu, I think, can be understood as reflecting where these people are. Nonetheless, God has invited them. They can survive the encounter. Now, that's only one way to read it, I think. The other way to read it is Vayochu Vayishtu, to look to see Vayochu Vayishtu. Vayishtu is actually very strange. But what are they eating and drinking? And perhaps what they're eating, at least, are these sacrifices, because the Torah said before that they brought zvachim shlamim. A zevach is a sacrifice that you eat. In other words, partaking of the sacrifice, actually, of God's sacrifice, is a way of enabling one to stand in God's presence. Vayochu vayishtu. Partaking, because the sacrifice is something that allows you to be in God's presence or to survive the divine encounter. So there are two different ways to read the Vayochu vayishtu. I personally think that it's saying something, I wouldn't say negative is too strong a word, but it's a reflection upon, there's something here that actually is very odd. You have these the former slaves seeing God, eating and drinking. It means that God is inviting them into this relationship, but there's something about this which is problematic. And of course, Moshe is going to leave to get the tablets and to get the commandments about the building the Mishkan, and the people feel he's not back in time. That's the story of the golden calf. And right away, a violation of the first of the 10 commandments and a violation of what Moshe said afterwards in Sefer HaBrit. The first line of Sefer HaBrit at the end of chapter 20, O tasuni ti Eloi chesed Eloi zahav. The first thing God says, do not make gods of silver or gold, which of course is the story of the golden calf. And what the Chumash might be doing is setting this up. In other words, don't be so surprised about the golden calf. What do you expect from the former slaves who can only connect to a God that they can actually see? That's my suggestion. Let me stop here and take comments or questions, and then just to say briefly about what the plan is in terms of how we'll continue over here.
Yeah, I
Yes.
have two comments,
Go
Rabbi.
ahead. Yes, please.
In Sefer Yirmiyahu, it talks briefly about the time in the wilderness as if it were a honeymoon between the people and God. And so I don't think the Torah is giving us the whole story. And my second comment is, with all the complaining that goes on in the Midbar, it's almost like the people are toddlers. And, you know, the parents have to put up with their whiny toddlers, but they don't reject them. And they do, in fact, have a bond with them. So I don't think it's surprising that even though the people complained over and over in the Midbar, that yet God made a covenant with us.
No, I agree with you. Let me put you this way. I think first of all, there are many different perspectives on the same event, multiple perspectives. It's never black and white. When you talk about any kind of relationship, it's always complicated. One question we can ask is this. I think this is a question, and we'll get to the golden calf as well. In other words, there are two different ways to read the story. We're coming up to Pesach. Purim is over, and now we're moving towards the next holiday of Pesach, the beginning, I would say, of Jewish peoplehood. And we celebrate at the Seder and throughout the year. Every Shabbat, we make Kiddush on Shabbat. Zecher Yitziat Mitzrayim. Zecher Yitziat Mitzrayim. Yitziat Mitzrayim is the event in our tradition that we're always remembering. All the festivals, Shabbat, and in many other ways as well, we are always told to remember the fact that we left the land of Egypt. Now, what is very curious, and this is very basic to the Seder too, is that virtually everybody that left the land of Egypt dies in the desert. And actually, they're condemned to die in the desert after about a year. The second year, we're already condemned. We're not going to make it into the land. Those 38 years, we're wandering about in the desert, going nowhere. So the question can be raised, why are we celebrating the Exodus? Why don't we mark in our calendars as the central event, possessing the land, which after all was the goal. You're going to leave Egypt and go enter a land of milk and honey. But no, our tradition doesn't, not at all. The Torah itself reminds us over and over again to remember the experience in Egypt, both as slaves and the freedom from Egypt. And our rabbinic tradition, certainly in our liturgy, in our practice, is constantly talking about the Exodus from Egypt. And the story of the Seder was probably the core ritual of the Jewish people, certainly the most popular one. It's all about the Exodus. It's not about the land. And that the point is, you can read the story in two ways. You can read it, the story of the Exodus, as the people that left Egypt were failures. They were supposed to go into the land, and they never made it there. It's one way to read it. And there's another way to read it. They weren't failures, because it's a process, because it doesn't take place over one generation. They succeeded in leaving Egypt. Now, they couldn't take the next steps. Okay, then it's up to the next generation to pick up and take the next steps. And I think that larger question can be raised about the whole story of the Chumash, basically, but about the desert. I think that our tradition has chosen to see these people not as failures, but as those who took that important first step. And without that first step, we never go anyplace. And the whole idea of the Seder is the connection between generations. No one generation does it alone. And we are building upon what's been done in the past, and hopefully trying to correct some of the mistakes of the past, and our own mistakes as well. So I think that's the larger question over here. And the Chumash tells it as it is. The Chumash does not hide anything. But again, there are different ways to, we talk about Yirmiyahu. I remember following me into the desert. That is true. I mean, we did follow God into the desert. It's also true we were thrown out of Egypt. I mean, there are multiple perspectives over here. And that's the beauty of learning this, that it's never so simple. It's never simple when you deal with human beings or relationships. But I'm simply making the point over here about this very strange verse. They beheld God and they ate and drank. And I think what the Chumash might be suggesting is, which in a way is in our favor. There's the story, we'll get to the golden calf, which is maybe the most important story of the book. And one can ask the question that the Medrash has Moshe asking God, what did you expect? That's the Medrash says to God. Moshe turns to God, well, what are you expecting? They're a bunch of slaves. Not only a bunch of slaves, they built it with all the gold and silver. How'd they get the gold and silver in the first place? You gave it to them. So what do you want from them? Have you looked in the mirror lately? The Medrash talks that way, and God agrees. Okay, they're not going to make it, but the project moves forward. I think that's the point. But we'll come back to this point over and over again. It's pretty basic. Anybody else for a comment?
Yeah. Sandra, and
Yes.
then
Yeah, thank you. So Rabbi, I just had a thought when you were talking about the sprinkling of the blood and the Brit. Could it be that since similar wording is used when the Israelites had to paint the doorposts of their homes with the blood in Mitzrayim, and that was, one could argue, the beginning of their accepting the Brit, because that was actually a huge risk for them to do that right in the midst of the Mitzrayim, and that after the revelation, Moses sprinkles the blood upon the Could that be perhaps some sort of bookending and really what's the word, validating what Ramban is saying, which is that's the whole point of Yetziat Mitzrayim. So if the blood on the doorpost began the Yetziat, okay, and this is post revelation, quote unquote, closures the Yetziat portion, could it in fact be that those two sprinklings of the blood are meant to signal to us that that's the point of the Yetziat was?
Yeah, they're certainly related. First of all, the blood on the door, it's the blood of a sacrifice. The Korban Pesach is a sacrifice. And the blood there, it was what protects the house. In other words, it's a sacrifice over there that allows the people in the house to survive the divine encounter. It's exactly the same point. for sure. It's there. It's about the house. It's about the beginnings of community, and there's no question. The beginnings of community are actually revelation. The book of Exodus is about a set of revelations. What makes revelation possible in each case is sacrifice, because God accepts the proxy. So there's more to say about it, but there's no question. You're right on that. That the Korban Pesach is very much connected to. It's a precursor to the Mishkan, and it's a precursor to the story right over here. The blood is thrown upon the people. There it's thrown upon the house, which houses the people and protects the people. And here it's what allows, I think, this covenantal sacrifice is what allows the people to experience God, even as they're eating and drinking. And the Chumash makes this point. God did not harm them. Why does the Torah have to say that? Because you expect God would harm them. Because how can they stand in God's presence, eating and drinking? What is this? No, because this is what God has demanded, has wanted, and God accepts this, even though.
So isn't it,
yeah.
Rabbi? So that isn't that what we say at the Seder when we say "B'damai" twice? "B'damai chayi, b'damai chayi." I'm thinking as you're talking that maybe both of those "B'damai chayis" reflect both the bookends, because otherwise here we are eating and drinking at the Seder. I mean, what gives us the chutzpah to do this? And the answer is God gave us the permission to do it.
Right, no doubt. But "B'damai chayi" has to do with what the Medrash talks about. "V'amulach b'damai chayi" is. That actually is a later addition to the Haggadah, but the basic point is correct, that what allows us to leave Egypt in the Medrash is the commandments, whether it's Dam Pesach or Dam Milah, that is what allows us to be worthy of leaving. And both Pesach and Milah are covenantal. They're the two covenantal mitzvot. So it's very much connected.
Thank you.
I'll stop at this point then. Again, to remind everyone, next week we have, in addition to this class, we have the Rappaport lecture at 12 o'clock next week. Hope everybody can attend, tell your friends. Look forward to continuing. We're here, as far as this class is concerned, I'm not going to deal with the mitzvot of chapter 21, 22, 23. That's going to be for future, maybe the next set of sessions. I think we're going to jump right away to the story of the golden calf. And we'll deal with that for the remainder of the time we have together. And then we'll go back and spend some time on two things. Number one, the laws of Mishpatim. We'll see how much time we spend on that. We might spend the whole semester on it. And then there's the Mishkan itself, how the Mishkan is set up, its significance, the various vessels of the Mishkan. Those are two big topics. But I think we're going to continue with the plan to go right away to the golden calf episode, the end of chapter 24, and then we'll jump to chapter 32, end of 31, the episode of the golden calf. Okay, thank you all.
You can sign up for the Rappaport lecture and all other Drisha classes at drisha.org/classes. Thank you to everyone who asked questions. Thank you to everyone who's just asked some questions in chat, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to them in time. If you want to ask them directly to Rabbi Silber, you can reach him at dsilber@drisha.org.
Right. Okay. Very good. Thank you.